I cannot hear you, but all right. This the prompt for us.
Now live stream. You can start.
Super. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this day. We're really glad to restart and relaunch the Global Research Forum and Diaspora Transnationalism series where we invite an expert. So we're calling it the Expert Dialogue Series. If you're a member of GRFDT or have been following us in any of the spaces, you will know that we have had similar conversations last year, usually very thematic and trying really to address what's happening and trying to pick a topic that's relevant to either migration governance or indeed in the development cooperation space. And this year, we decided that we're going to kick off looking into decolonization. My name is Paddy Sianga Knudsen. I am one of the vice presidents of the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, and really happy to welcome you here today. And I will not have the privilege of introducing our expert because I will leave that to our moderator, research fellow who joins us and who has ably put this program behind. And so I will now hand over to Manjima Anjana, who will run the conversation and introduce our expert. Just to say thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you can stay the hour. We look forward to engaging with you also during the chat and to also hearing your reflections, both from members of GRFDT, but indeed for those who will be joining as part of our friends and our network. Manjima, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Paddy. So I am Manjima Anjana, and I am a PhD scholar at Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, Shiv Nadar University, Delhi, India. And I have been a fellow at GRFDT for the past 4 years. I have been a close collaborator with Ms. Paddy on launching the Expert Dialogue series, which aims to bring together experts from various fields and disciplines to discuss and analyze diverse migration and diaspora-related issues, and honestly to have good conversations. So far, we have held discussions on various topics such as the pros and cons of remittances, crisis in Sudan and impact on migration, and climate change-induced mobilities. We have been on a hiatus, but we are back, and this is our first discussion on the theme Decolonizing Migration Governance, Perspectives from the Global South. So in migration studies, there is already an awareness and a critique of how contemporary migration governance is shaped largely by institutions of the Global North and legal frameworks that represent the interests of the Global North countries. And this asymmetry not only marginalizes perspectives from the Global South, but also sustains certain historical patterns of control over movement, labor, and citizenship. And hence, it's important to decolonize migration governance, but we believe it's even more important to understand what it means to decolonize. And we have Professor Nandita Sharma here, who shall be guiding us through. I'll take a brief moment to introduce Professor Sharma here. So Professor Nandita Sharma is a professor of sociology at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. She is an activist scholar whose research is shaped by the social movements she is engaged with, including No Borders movement and those struggling for the planetary commons. She is the author of Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, and Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, to state a few. So the topic of today's discussion is Migrants and Natives, the Post-Colonial Trap. So Professor Sharma's recent work, Home Rule, National Sovereignty and Separation of Natives and Migrants, provides a powerful critique of how the transition from imperial orders to nation states reconfigured the meanings of who is a migrant and who is a native. In this conversation, we aim to explore the historical and structural dimensions of migration governance, its entanglements with nationalism, capitalism, and colonial legacies, and the possibilities of decolonizing migration governance. We shall have the discussion for around 45 minutes to an hour, followed by an open discussion with the audience. So, my introductory question. Migration has always been a fundamental aspect of human history, yet in the post-colonial world order, we see an intensified fixation on migrant as an object of control and exclusion. At the risk of asking Professor Sharma to summarize her book, I'd like to ask her, how did the emergence of nation states and the post-colonial New World Order transform the political value of migration? And what structural features of this order sustain contemporary anxieties about migrants? Thank you, Professor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, first of all, to Manjima and to Patty and everyone at the Institute that's made this event possible. I'm really pleased to be here with you all. So in terms of your question, what structural features order and sustain contemporary anxieties about migrants, I would say that we need to begin at the beginning, which is that human mobility should not be equated with migration, and we should not assume that people's mobility has always been governed, right? So I think that, you know, one of the things that we know from archaeological evidence, from anthropological evidence, from historical evidence, is that human beings have always moved. Right? Our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for 200 to 300,000 years, right? We know that people have moved from East Africa to the entire planet over the course of, you know, tens of thousands of years. So there's been human mobility for a very, very long time. Migration, however, is when that mobility is regulated and restricted in any way, right? And I think that how that arises is alongside the rise of state power and the rise of class rule, right? So as soon as some human beings decide that they want to rule over others and exploit their labor in order to enrich and empower themselves, they start controlling people's mobility, right? We still don't have the figure of the migrant at this point. The figure of the migrant really doesn't arise until the 19th century, which is very late in the history of Homo sapiens, right? But prior to the 19th century, where there were states, and there weren't states everywhere, even in the 19th century, although it was, you know, the world was really closing down by that point. You know, some political theorists and historians have dated the rise of class rule and state rule to about 5,000 years ago, right? That would be James Scott, for example, has argued that. And so it was, you know, the kind of first ways that human mobility was controlled was to try and keep people in the control of the rulers, right? And so that usually meant that they were enslaved, and therefore their mobility was absolutely restricted by those who claimed to own them. But more so, imperial states, for instance, or monarchical states, feudal states of all sorts, tried to control people's mobility by basically keeping them as close to the rulers as possible so that they could be taxed, conscripted, and their labor exploited, right? So we don't get the rise of the... Sorry, we don't get, we don't get the figure of the migrant and the state category of the migrant, because I think that that's important to point out as well. The migrant is a product of state rule, right? And a particular kind of state rule. So two things happened in the 19th century that led to the rise of this figure of the migrant. And for me, the migrant is the person whose mobility and whose mobility is regulated and restricted from entering state territory, right? And so that's a huge change in human history, right? Most controls on human mobility have been trying to keep people in and not to let them out of the control of states and class rulers. In the 19th century, we start seeing classes and, you know, class rule and state rule become much more interested in keeping people out, right? Or at least regulating how they come to live inside state territory, right? And it's important to point out that that only happens after the abolition of slavery, right? The transatlantic slave trade, which existed, from the 16th century to the 19th century, was a major source of ESP. It was the major source of the power of the most powerful states on the planet. And when it was abolished, not because those states and rulers, woke up and realized that this was an enormous injustice, but because of the abolition movement, right? The abolition movement across the world ended slavery, and that put capitalists and state rulers, at that time they were imperial rulers, right? Imperial state rulers, that threw them into a tailspin. How are we going to access workers, and not just access workers in terms of numbers of workers, but how are we going to control and discipline their labor? How are we going to exploit them and get the maximum value that we can get out of their labor? And that is the rise of immigration controls, right? So there's a long history of the control over human mobility wrapped up in oppression, exploitation, expropriation, right? And this is how the figure of the migrant arises. So that's the first point I wanted to make, is that migration is not just human movement. It's much more than that. You have to, when we start talking about migration, we're really talking about state and class control over people's bodies, over their mobility, over their labor, right? And so when we talk about, the structural features of the current order, right, we live in a world where the entire world is, striated by an immigration regime, right? And this is a cooperative regime. This is an international regime, right? It requires states to cooperate with one another to put it into place, right? So if I need a visa from India to travel to the United States, and that visa is incredibly difficult to obtain, that is state cooperation, right? The government of India is cooperating with the government of the United States to control and regulate and restrict people's freedom of mobility. Only certain people are going to be granted that visa. Only people with those visas are going to be allowed onto boats and planes in order to arrive in the United States, right? So it's a cooperative mechanism. So, so that's one of the structural features, is the rise of a world of nation states, all of which are cooperating with one another to implement, these kind of paper walls, paper walls being much more effective than, the ones made out of brick or steel. So in this world, I would argue that those people who get classified as migrants, which isn't everyone who moves, right? Like I am, I have the citizenship of both Canada and the United States. So I have two rich world passports. My mobility is more or less, it's still governed, of course, right? I still need to have the permission of various states to enter their territories. But with my American or Canadian passport, that's pretty much, my mobility is amongst the least restricted in the world, right? The vast majority of people in the world, the vast majority of people in the world have far greater restrictions on their mobility than I do, right? So not all of us are, all of our mobility is controlled, but not all of us are considered migrants, right? So I think we need to pay attention to that kind of social basis for this figure of the migrant. So one of the kind of common sense ways of understanding the migrant is someone who's unwanted, right? Someone who is devalued. And we could actually argue that migrants are most valued when they are devalued, right? So here in the United States, for instance, the largest category of people who are migrants in the United States are those who are classified as undocumented, right? That's the largest category of migrants in the United States, far outweighs the numbers of people who are admitted on work visas or permanent resident visas or et cetera, right? So the kind of social and political hostility to migrants is a sustaining feature of the current global order, right? For example, the United States economy would collapse without undocumented migrants. They are absolutely key workers in major sectors of the US economy, right? The construction industry, the service industry, the agricultural industry, the manufacturing industry. These industries rely on undocumented workers because their undocumented status makes them much more susceptible to the demands of employers, right? Makes their labor much cheaper to employ, thereby raising profits. And in terms of the state, creates an alibi for the states for why they're failing to ensure the prosperity and the well-being and the peace of its citizenry, right? So the migrant serves all of these functions in today's world, right? It serves a major economic function, and it also serves a major political function of a scapegoat at the ready to provide an alibi to nation states who are utterly incapable structurally, because we live in a world capitalist system. Nation states are structurally incapable of ensuring prosperity for all of its citizens. So there has to be some reason that prosperity is not coming to be, and that is the existence of the foreigner, right? And the migrant is the kind of quintessential foreigner within. So I know that was a really long answer to your question, and we only have so much time, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You very succinctly captured the major argument of your book as well. But you mentioned the economic and political value of the migrant. Let me point the political value of the migrant first. So in the recent years, especially with the Trump regime coming to power in the US, but not just Trump, it has been happening quite a while before as well, there is a resurgence of nationalist populism associated particularly with the right or the conservative side, where migration is framed as a central threat to the national identity and economic security, despite the economic value that you just pointed out. So from Trump's Make America Great Again to AfD's growing electoral strength in Germany, the far right has strategically positioned migration at the heart of its political agenda. So how do we historically contextualize this nativist resurgence? Is it a part of recurring cycle of exclusionary politics because nation states always need a scapegoat? Or does it signal a more profound transformation in global economic and political structures? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that a world of nation states does represent a profound change in the both economic and political structure of the world, right? And that's why I talk about something called the post-colonial New World Order, right? So post-colonialism is the delegitimization of imperial state rule, right? Post-colonialism doesn't mean the end of the practices that we associate with colonialism, but it does mean the end of the political legitimacy of colonial rule, right? Or of imperial rule. And associatedly, nationalist movements were not the only ones that were fighting colonialism, but they certainly became the dominant force in anti-colonial movements. And much of the struggle against colonialism was done, under the guise of national liberation, right? National liberation was also a liberation for capital, right? The United States, for example, was a major force in changing the world order from a world of imperial states to a world of nation states. And it understood very clearly by the 1940s that a major impediment to its global hegemony, which it gained after World War II, right? A major impediment to the US's global hegemony were imperial markets, right? Imperial states came with imperial markets, and those markets were closed, right? If capitalists from the United States wanted to exploit the resources and the labor, for example, of British India, they would need the permission of the British imperial state, right? But once India becomes an independent nation state, then it can negotiate directly with its new leaders, right? Who are far, far weaker than the British imperial state were, right? So we after World War II and, you know, the transformation of the world where, you know, imperial states collapsed, the two biggest going into World War II, the British and the French, by the 1960s have collapsed. And we have a world of independent nation states and a world in which capital actually became much more mobile, right? Investors were able from around the world to go to a multiple number of independent, now so-called independent nation states and get deals, right? And those deals were easy to get because there was no competition in terms of the world's biggest military, right? The growing economic force after World War II of the United States. So we've always lived in this world of nation states, you know, since the end of World War II, which obviously is not that long. But, you know, over that, you know, 75, 80-year period, it has been an incredibly uneven world, right? And so, you know, this is one of the ironies, is that national liberation struggles promised people, right, that they would become self-determinate, that they would determine what happens to themselves in whatever territory the nation was claiming, right? But what they left out of the equation was the capitalist world system, right? As if somehow these nation states would govern capital, right? Not even the wealthiest, most powerful state can govern capital, right? The US is absolutely subject to the whims of capital, as we saw yesterday when Trump, you know, said to the auto industry in the United States, okay, you're exempt from the tariffs for a while, right? Because the auto industry can control what the US president does, right? So we live in this world where each nation state, the United, you know, the most powerful, the United States, Germany, China, promise each of its citizenry that they are self-determinate, that they are sovereign, they get to control what happens inside their territories, but they don't, right? And secondly, there is no interest in any of these states to actually promote equality and justice, right? They exist as capitalist states, right? So they are also organizing competition, exploitation, and of course, division, right? So each of these states have to figure out, how do they continue to justify their existence to their citizenry, all of whom are affected by, you know, the capitalist world system, right? You can be a US citizen and have this powerful passport, but it doesn't mean you're going to have a job, right? It doesn't mean you're going to have health care. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a roof over your head, right? So how do you justify this world? You justify it constantly by pointing to the foreigner. And again, this is one of the legacies of anti-colonial movements that were nationalist, right? Nationalist anti-colonial movements, which, just again to emphasize, were not the only ones. There were non-nationalist, even anti-nationalist anti-colonial movements, but they didn't win, right? And we're still living with the legacy of their loss, right? The national liberation movements won the anti-colonial battle. And in doing so, they put into place this idea that the problem of colonialism was always just a problem of the existence of foreigners, right? Once we get rid of the foreigners, we will be okay, right? We being the newly constructed nation, we will be okay, right? So the foreigner has always been the central figure of demonization, both, you know, in the nationalist anti-colonial struggles and certainly within nation states. So there's a structural hostility to foreignness in in nation states, including the national liberation states, right? The migrant becomes the quintessential foreigner, right? There's no nation state in the world in which every single person living in it is a citizen. None, right? There are people in every single nation state who are denied citizenship for a variety of reasons. Some of them may never have moved ever in their lives, but they're still denied citizenship, right? So they're legally classified as migrants. So those people in each nation state are the ones that, you know, nationalists can point to as the problem. You know, we can see this happening in, I'm sure many of you know much more about what is happening in India under the Modi regime with, you know, the growing desire to declassify more and more people as Indian citizens and to constantly scapegoat the figure of the, you know, Bengali migrant, for example, as the source of the poverty and the insecurity of Indian citizen workers, right? But that's basically, you know, that politics is not unlike what is happening right now in the United States, right? That somehow, you know, the most impoverished, the most politically precarious people in the United States are described as the most powerful, right? The ones that are capable of destroying the, you know, the US and its national security, right? So this is this weird world that we live in, but it's a world that was created by nationalists.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. To prod you a little further there, I would like you to nuance the category of foreigner a bit further as well. For instance, in America, most of the residents historically are Europeans who migrated to the place, but somehow they have historically positioned themselves as the original nationalist. Meanwhile, we also have the natives of America, the indigenous natives who also make a claim to the land, but at the same time the migrant, for instance, some migrants from Asia, Africa, etc., again for the nationalist Americans as well as for the Native Americans, are the outsider or the migrant. So how political is this category of foreigner? Who decides who's an outsider?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. Thank you. The category of the foreigner is, you know, is a floating signifier, right? Any one of us at any time can become a foreigner, right? So it's the category of the foreigner is in the power of those who control the state and the dominant social notion of nation to decide, right? That, you know, so it's an absolutely open-ended category. It can expand or it can contract depending on the political forces in play, right? When political forces demanding greater inclusion and equality are more powerful, the category of foreigner can contract. When it becomes more, when those movements become weaker, it can expand, right? So, you know, it's important to remember, for example, that here in the United States, my US citizenship certainly prevents me from being deported, right? But it doesn't prevent me from being hit on the street, right? For being an outsider, right? It doesn't prevent people from discriminating against people who look like me in the labor market because we don't really belong, right? So the category of foreigner has this kind of legal dimension, but also a political and social dimension. But, you know, citizenship stripping, turning people legally into foreigners, largely for the purposes of making them deportable, right? or at least detainable in concentration camps, is a long and true and tried strategy of the, of authoritarianism, of even fascism, right? Like one of the first acts of the Nazi regime was to strip the German citizenship of Jewish people, right? Who were German citizens. Their citizenship was taken away. They were legally classified as foreigners and therefore deportable, right? And socially exterminable, right? And this is what we've seen in Myanmar with the stripping of the citizenship of Rohingya, right? And the massive refugee crisis there. We can see this happening in India. Donald Trump is currently talking about changing the citizenship criteria in the United States from birthright citizenship to to blood-based citizenship, right? What was the citizenship of your parents, for example? So it's always open-ended and permeable, right? And so it puts us on guard to really understand that placing people in the category of foreigner is always the first step in really justifying incredibly violent treatment towards them.
Thank you so much. So moving on from foreigner, which is a signifier, to another signifier, that is decolonization. Let me ask you the million-dollar question. In the Home Rule, you argue that postcolonialism contained rather than fulfilled demands for decolonization by retaining the nation-state model. So what does it truly mean to decolonize migration governance? Are there alternative frameworks beyond the nation states that could reimagine mobility and belonging? If you could shed some light on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, it's such an important and huge question. To decolonize migration, we need to recognize, like even this language that we're using, decolonization, right? As, as the epitome of justice and freedom, right? And liberation, like that in and of itself is very interesting to me, particularly in light of the fact that the dominant understanding of decolonization is national liberation, right? So if national liberation is the dominant framework that people trying to decolonize things are operating within, national sovereignty is also the basis of governance controls in the world today over mobility, right? So those two things cannot coexist. We cannot decolonize migration and maintain a world of nation states and national sovereigns and nationalists who imagine that their little piece of the world belongs only to them, right? And that they have control over who gets to have rights and live and work there in equal terms with everyone else, right? So those two things have to be separated, right? The national part of liberation has to be jettisoned in order for there to be truly a decolonization. So maybe I should define for myself and for you what I think decolonization means, right? Decolonization to me means ending the practices that were associated with colonialism, not just who rules, right? Not just, is it the British rule or do the Indians rule, right? Like, we need to separate those two things out. The practices of colonialism were expropriation of land, right? The practices of colonialism was the exploitation of people's labor, right? The practices of colonialism was the oppression and the denigration of those whose land was stolen and labor exploited, right? Like, both of my parents were born as, natives of British India. That was their legal classification at birth. They tell me stories of what it was like to live under British Indian rule, right? You were absolutely considered a lower sort of being, right? In terms of where you could sit, in terms of what places you could go to, in terms of whether you were seen as intelligent or worthy of life, right? So, that's the practices of colonialism. That's what we need to end, right? People need to have their own control over their lives, right? That's what real self-determination means, right? Am I dependent on a ruling class in order for my ability to have my needs met and the needs of, the people that I care about, or not, right? It doesn't matter to me who that ruling class is, right? Does it really matter to someone in India whether the people who are stealing their land and exploiting their labor are also Indian citizens? Would it be worse if they were British citizens? Do the billionaires of India actually respect and treat workers in India with dignity and respect? No. Exactly the same way that my parents talked about being treated under British rule, right? And in fact, we could say it's worse, right? Certainly the disparities between rich and poor today are far greater than they were under British rule, right? So when we're talking about decolonization, we need to actually focus on the practices that we associate with colonization and not the kind of identity of the ruling entity, right? What that means, we also, I, for example, am involved in movements struggling to regain our commons. Now, that might not be a terminology that everyone is familiar with, but the commons is a way of relating to land, and by land, I mean the earth. It's a way of relating to the earth and to our fellow creatures, right? That is non-exclusionary, right? That is based on the understanding and the respect that every living being has an absolute right to live on this planet and to live well on this planet, right? That is a very old idea. That idea is much older than the idea of, class, race, gender. That's a very old idea. And it's one that has been slowly eliminated from our planet, right? And we need to bring that back. I think that, we need to have a change of consciousness of who we are. Who is this we? What is this collective that we belong to? Is it the nation? Is it the race? Or is it a much more planetary, much more open-ended, much more egalitarian notion of who we are? And then, of course, that we needs a material base of power, and that material base of power is the earth, right? So, just to quote a 16th century person in, what we now call England, right? Whose commons was being stolen by the English ruling class, right? The earth is a common treasury, right? I feel much closer to that person in the 16th century who was, we would now see as a white English man than to, many of the people that are nationalized or racialized like I am today, right? So we need to have a much more expansive understanding of basically our world. Who are we? What is our place in the world? And how do we organize it so that no one can be excluded?
Thank you, Professor Sharma. That was a very, very interesting answer. So, as I understand it, decolonization translates to ending the practices of colonialism as well as denationalizing the denationalizing the migration governance. But let me have the nation state on the trial box for some more time and ask you on the ability of nation states to accommodate practices like, for instance, the commons, recognizing the commons and legally sanctifying practices associated with the commons. And on that note, I'd also like to mention that I was absolutely enamored by your project, Eating in Public, which absolutely captured my interest. And if you could shed some light on what happened on the project after. I remember the piece has ended with the state absolutely damaging the small plantation that you had, but you starting a shop which and to enable exchanges amongst the public. So what is the update on that regard as well, if you could briefly mention? Thank you.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I need to say it again, but I don't think that the nation state can accommodate the commons within it, right? Many people misidentify public land as the commons, right? The public land is not common land, right? I can't speak for everywhere in the world, but here, in the United States and also in Canada, where I grew up, you can't grow food on public land. That's not your land to grow food on. You can't sleep on public land. You can't build a home on public land, right? Public land is state land, and it determines what you can do. And it's primarily most useful for those people who also have private property, right? If I have my own house to sleep in on my own plot of land that I have private title over, then I can go to the public park and play football and have a nice day, right? But if I don't have any private property, I'm completely excluded from that public land because I can't sleep there. I can't grow my food there. It's completely not for me. So the state cannot accommodate the commons because the state is built on the erasure and the eradication of the commons, right? Not just the nation state. I'm not just opposed to the national form of state sovereignty. I'm opposed to state sovereignty. I'm opposed to state rule. And to be opposed to state rule means to be opposed to class rule, right? Because ruling classes create states. That's the whole purpose of the state, is to enforce through violence at the, as either the last or the first resort, to do what the ruling classes want, right? So our project, Eating in Public, my partner and I started this project about a little over 20 years ago. And we basically try and take up a little space within this capitalist nation state that we live in, to basically embody and to enact being commoners, right? To say that there is a way to have access to food that is outside of the capitalist marketplace. We can grow our own food. We may be told that you can't grow food here because this is state property, but we go ahead and do it anyways. We don't ask for permission. And we see what happens, right? And sometimes when the state comes in and takes away that garden, right, that people have spent a lot of time planting and are waiting to harvest, people get angrier and they become more clear on what state power is about, right? This fallow piece of state property, all of a sudden, it cannot be used to grow papayas. Why not? Right? So people get more enlivened and people start understanding that relationship of force and coercion that the state represents, right? And they connect, so you play out these kind of David and Goliath scenes. And, our project, which began about 20 years ago, is bigger now than we could have ever imagined, right? Like, there are many, many more people on this island that I live on engaged in commoning activities. right? The idea of the commons is gaining political purchase, right? So I do think that eating in public is obviously this tiny little project, but every social movement that has ever existed was once tiny, right? So that gives us hope.
Thank you. Thank you for making it very clear. I'd end with one very small question. Now that you've made it clear that states are to a certain extent an antagonist force in especially accommodating demands of decolonizing, right, like that of commons, I was wondering, how do we engage with the state? Because state often seems like this all-powerful entity you cannot but engage with. For instance, as a part of my project, I engage with the pastoralist communities in Gujarat, India a lot. And it has come to notice that often their strategies of engagement are quite creative. It's neither a strategy of absolute resistance nor a strategy of absolute submission to the state. And there is this gray space whereby they try to interact but also try to stay under the radar and, and enable practices whereby they can live within the shadow of the all powerful state. So, how do you believe this engagement shaping out? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We cannot ignore this, right? I recognize that what I would like to see in the world, a world without class rule, a world without states, is far from being realized, right? It will never be realized if we cannot name what we want,
Sure.
right? But it's very far from being realized. And I would never say to people that any engagement with the state is somehow, selling out or, should be denounced. I would, for example, having legal status in the place that you live is absolutely crucial, right? So I would never discourage someone, and I would do everything I could to help that person gain, for instance, like legal status in the United States or citizenship, right? But I think the difference is, what is the political horizon that we see in the future, right? Or before us? Is that political horizon, for example, I've been working in the immigrant justice movement, for most of my life. Is the political horizon just getting everyone US citizenship status? Is that the end goal? Right? If that's the end goal, then I have to acknowledge that is going to benefit a very small number of people, but the entire apparatus of the national border regime is going to be kept in place, and people are still going to be discriminated on the basis of whether they're a citizen or not, right? So that I'm not satisfied with that being the end of my political horizon. So to me, the political horizon is no borders. Right? A world of no class, no states, no borders, right? And that's the political horizon towards which I am heading. So for all of us, when we deal with the state, we have to deal with it. It's best to deal with it in ways that can get us closer to our political horizon, rather than foreclosing that horizon permanently, right? So if I was to keep the politics that so many continue to have, right, where the end goal is legal status, then I am giving the state power to determine who gets to live and who gets to die, right? That's the power that I'm giving it. For in other ways that I could, try and kind of make legal status less important would be, for instance, to argue that everyone who lives somewhere ought to be able to vote for their city council, right? Or ought to have access to a driver's license, or, ought to have access to joining a union, right? Those kinds of things are not going to foreclose the politics that I'm heading towards. So I think that there's ways of engaging with the state that give it more power, and ways of engaging with the state that start diminishing its power, right?
Mhm.
So, but as you mentioned with the people that you work with, no one ever puts up with it completely, right? There's never been a point in human history where people have just lied down and said, do whatever you want, right? Like, just tell me what to do and I will gladly do it, right? It's never. People are always resisting, right? For me as a political organizer, it's how to strengthen that resistance and radicalize it so that we can we can live in a world where we have to spend less time resisting and more time living.
Thank you so much. You have armed me with certain conceptual tools that are very, very empowering. And you have solved certain fundamental dilemmas in my head about migration, mobility, and decolonization. I would like to open the floor for discussion now with the audience. Questions, please. Thank you. If you could raise your hand and speak, that would be really great. Yes, Tane.
Hello, Professor. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. I immensely enjoyed it. I'm a PhD scholar in the Department of International Relations in Shiv Nadar Institute of Eminence. I have three questions. And the first one comes from the definition, or the operational definition of decolonization that came up in the conversation, which is basically undoing the effects of colonization, as I can recall. So this is exactly, or not exactly, this is very similar to the kind of language that the right is speaking right now in the country India. By the right, I refer to the present ruling party, BJP. And that kind of has made a lot of people intervene in this debate and say that how the very language of decolonization has been misappropriated or appropriated by the right. So that is the first question, that how do you see a conceptual tool, analytic, which had a lot of emancipatory potential, what is the afterlife of such a analytic? And this is particularly coming from the question of the afterlife of decolonization when it penetrates spheres like culture. So the essential discourse of decolonization that I'm referring to is, are you there? Yeah. The essentially is one that of cultural decolonization that is very, very prevalent. And that's the first question. Second, uh, when you target colonization, you cannot do it without targeting its twin. I think I call it the modernity. So in India, again, talking about the contemporary political discourse, we see a politics which is primarily a identitarian politics based on identity, which is not only thinking about undoing the effects of colonization, but also what we uh, essentially link and associate with modernity, so as to say. Okay. And we see a kind of, I don't know, should I call it orthodox, but a notion which is filled with hierarchies. So, what do you think about this identitarian politics? This was the second question. And the third one, which is something that really got me thinking in the lecture. So, when we are thinking about undoing the effects of colonization, for example, in the case of India, once we undo it, the picture that we are looking at in the case of notion of common is one where it is marked by certain hierarchies like that of caste. So the moment we move away from state rule, and how I understand it is, for example, radical decentralization, a total community level governance, would it not again create certain levels of hierarchy in the as for example, I am giving, like in the case of India, we saw there was a very strong caste basis for the distribution of land. Okay, so when we are thinking about a radical decentralization, won't it just create other levels of hierarchy? So yeah, those are my three questions. Thank you. I hope I am able to convey it clearly. Yeah. Professor, you
Sorry,
are on
I
mute.
was unmuted. Yes, sorry. I think I got dropped for a second and came back, so I hope I didn't miss too much of your questions. So I'll take them in the order that you pose them. So it's not just Modi who is talking about the ongoing need to decolonize ourselves, right? People in Britain are talking about the need to decolonize themselves, right? It's hilarious. Cabra kind of way, obviously. But what they have in common, this is really interesting, right? What people in India and people in Britain of that ilk, right, have in common is that they both see themselves as natives, right? They, the far right in Britain literally talks about themselves as the indigenous people of Britain, right? Modi talks about Hindus as the natives of India, right? That this is the core original people who, lived in India. So I would say that what they're doing is a legacy both of colonial rule, right? It was imperial states who called people that they were colonizing natives, right? Native actually is a very interesting term. Like the original meaning of native was to be someone's servant, what it meant to be a native, right? So that's that, calling people that you're colonizing natives of British India, natives of Jamaica, natives of the 13 colonies, whatever. The reason they're being called that is because you're seeing them in that kind of class way, right? When nationalists won the fight over what decolonization would look like, they transformed that idea of the native into the nation, right? The true member of the nation became what was understood as the person of the place. Or this is our place, right? We get to decide what happens here. And again, because these are made up categories, right? These are arbitrary political categories to place people in. You can place anyone you want in them, and you can take other or once inside them and take them out, right? So it's again this floating signifier, right? So when people today talk about decolonization, they are primarily talking again about the foreigner who is usurping and taking that which is rightfully belongs to the nation, right? So nation states today are constantly relitigating and refighting the national liberation struggle over and over and over and over again, right? Precisely because the national liberation struggle was absolutely unable to deliver on its promises anywhere, right? Obviously, the most in the national liberation states where that rhetoric was most crucial, right? But it's affected everywhere. In Britain, people are talking about migrants colonizing them, right? Foreigners ruining their culture, ruining their religion, right? It's the same everywhere on the planet right now, right? I think we need to pay attention to the relationship between decolonizationism, it's a very, very strong relationship. And if we don't sever that link, we're always going to be one thing I forgot to say is like the reason it's framed as decolonization is because of post-colonialism, right? The nation state and nationalism is the legitimizing force for nation state rule, right? So talking about decolonization is always going to mobilize people like, oh yeah, I remember 75 years ago, you told me that if we were decolonized, we would be sovereign and we would get our land back and we would be prosperous, but none of that happened. So who's to blame, right? Let me see who's to blame here, right? It must be Muslims in India, right? Or it must be migrants in the United States, right? There's always this outsider that is creating all of the problems. I'm not quite sure if I heard you correctly about cultural decolonization. I don't know if I got that, but identitarian politics, I don't think it's a coincidence that identity as a huge driver of our sense of self, right? All humans are meaning makers. We try and make meanings of who we are, who are the people around us, what kind of world do we live in? You know, we're always making meanings, but it was in the 19th century that identity, right? I am this, became a crucial driver of our sense of self. And that is, ironically, also the time when imperial rule was under threat, right, around the world in their colonies. And so there was a divide, you know, what Mahmoud Mamdani, for instance, has called define and rule politics, right? Where there was a greater and greater attention from the mid-19th century on to more narrowly and defining who the natives of the colonies were, right? You are this kind of native, you are that kind of native. We're going to base it on your religion or your, you know, your level of modernity, you know, et cetera, right? So I don't think that is a coincidence. I think that identitarian politics today are the driving force for the rise of anti-migrant politics, right? And your last question about can a community a resolution to the state, right? Like if we organize at the community level, is that a resolution to the violence of state power, right? I think it depends on what we mean by community, right? And community level governance. Now, I am absolutely no expert on the social formation of community-based governance in India, for instance. I don't know the history of that and the source of that, but I would venture to guess that caste-based system, right, at the local level that allocated resources and also, you know, did what we associate colonizers doing, right? Take people's land, exploit their labor, denigrate those who we exploit the most, right? To me, I cannot imagine that happened in the absence of a state, right? It may not have been the kind of state at the level, at either its kind of centralized organization or at the scope and scale of the state that we have now. But, you know, to me, you can't have a caste system without a class system, right? You can't have a caste system without state rule, right? Some kind of, you know, at least a proto kind of state rule where some ruling group controls the force of violence. So I would not equate the commons with just, you know, simply the scale. We could have a commons that is at a planetary scale, right? It doesn't have to be this kind of local, small scale, village level grouping, right? So hierarchies exist as long as someone can impose them upon us, right? The refusal to accept hierarchies, what eliminates them, right? So the commons exists only as long as we continue to refuse to allow someone to rule over us, right? So I think that there's nothing inherent about what any community is capable of doing, right? It just means incredible vigilance to ensure that no one gets to rule, right? As soon as someone starts acting like a state, right, or acting like a ruler, that needs to be stopped, right? So it's a, you know, I know that sounds like kind of fanciful, but I can't imagine like how else we can be very clear on how not to reproduce violence. Right.
It does sound very logical. It just I'm a little unsure because I'm not sure whether we have a precedent for it. Have we in the history seen that kind of radical decentralization as such, like which is a community based living as you are describing? So that's the
We have plenty of examples of that, actually.
Okay.
You know, prior to the existence of class and state rule, remember, it's only about 5,000 years old. And when I say 5,000 years old, I don't mean the whole world was ruled by states 5,000 years ago, right? It was just in very small pockets of the world, right? Including along the Indus River Valley, unfortunately, right? But, you know, it was in small pockets of the world that states came to rule. Everyone else, you know, archaeologists, for example, when they uncover burial sites in non-state, non-class societies, they find much more, you know, egalitarian causes of death, right? They find that we don't have the bones of some people who were much bigger and much healthier than, you know, the bones of other people who were shrunk through malnutrition, right? We find a much more egalitarian cemetery in non-state societies than we do in state societies, right? So all the evidence that we have is that the key to an egalitarian society is the absence of class and state rule, right? Of course, it may not be perfect. There may be violence there. There may be someone who's trying to rule, but it will be, there's no evidence that all of human history has been one of hierarchies.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. If you could quickly respond to this question on the chat box from Domingos. How does the segmentation of labor market in the post-colonial states reflect colonial era racial and class hierarchies? How does this affect migration patterns across the generations? And to add to that, if you could elaborate a bit upon the role of diasporas in the decolonization of migration governance, as we have discussed through the course so far. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The segmentation of labor markets in post-colonial states versus how and whether they reflect colonial era hierarchies. I think that you know, one of the things that's very clear when we're talking about the governance of migration is that the greatest predictor of life outcomes today, right, is not class. It's not how we have been racialized. It's not how we have been gendered, right? The greatest predictor of life outcomes today is national citizenship. Which state do you hold citizenship in? That is going to be much more likely to have people be able to say how long you will live, how nourished your body will be, right? What level of healthcare do you have access to? What kind of jobs do you have access to, right? What level is your income? That is going to be the greatest predictor of life outcome today. That's from a study done by an economist named Branko Milanovic. So when we talk about, the global division of labor, we are used to talking about labor markets today in national terms, right? We've got the American labor market, the Indian labor market, the British labor market, the Australian labor market, the South African labor market, et cetera, et cetera. And within all of those labor markets, it's those who are denied citizenship, and particularly those who are rendered unlawful residents, who are at the bottom of the labor pool in terms of the level of wages and the amounts of power that they have to negotiate their working and living conditions, right? So we have a highly segmented labor market along citizenship lines, right? I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but certainly, the point that, for example, the labor market in, I'm thinking, for example, of the case of South Africa, right? The labor market in South Africa is one in which the battles that are being waged there are, between South African citizens and non-citizens there, right? That may not be true in many other places. Like, it's not the only segmentation that is occurring. So I'm getting all muddled in my thinking right now. So I'm just going to stop it there. But one of the things that I did want to point out, just with continuing the focus on migration, is it's important that we start with the understanding that the labor market is a world market. It always has been, right? Since the rise of capitalist empires, right? Starting with the British. We live in a world market for labor power. And in that world market for labor power, where you're going to work, which nation state in the world you're going to work, what currency you're going to be paid in, is inference, right? Let me just give you another example that might be useful in thinking about labor markets. The bottom 10% of the United States, right? So the United States is, considered the wealthiest country in the world. The bottom 10th of the United States, right? The people at the bottom 10% of the socioeconomic ladder, their lives are incredibly difficult, right? They're not going to have adequate housing. They're not going to have adequate education. They're not going to have adequate nutrition. They're not going to have adequate health care. They're going to be much more likely to be criminalized and caged, right? So their life is incredibly hard. But the bottom 10% in the United States is better off than 2/3 of the world's population, right? The poor in the United States, the very poor in the United States, are akin to the middle classes in India or China, right? So when we're talking about a world market for labor power, it absolutely makes sense that people are going to try to move, right, to where their labor is going to receive a better payout, right? So nation states collude amongst one another, right, to determine who gets to, like, under what conditions do people move, right? Like my family, I was born in India. When my family moved to Canada, we moved as permanent residents to Canada because my father was an engineer, and therefore he was able to, the points that Canada gave to people with engineering degrees. We were able to move on a plane, right? We were able to get on a plane in Delhi and fly to Canada. We didn't have to hire a smuggler and get on a rusty boat that's going to move us to Vancouver and then live in Canada without legal status and get the wages that that entails, right? So nation states are in collusion with one another in terms of determining how people are able to exercise their freedom to move, because people are exercising it at enormous numbers, right? More so now than ever before. But states and their immigration controls are shaping labor markets by determining what level of rights and access to social services you'll have depending on what status you're given, right? And when I'm thinking of, you know, just even my own father, of course, the Indian caste system, right, that had positioned us as Brahmins, gave him the access to that engineering education, right? Those generations of wealth and power and access that the caste system gives to those who invented it, right? Those who put themselves at the top, is also then in collusion with the Canadian government, giving people points based on their level of privilege in the states that they are coming from, right? So it's just, you know, it is a globally operative system, right? If we think of it that way. And so to undo it, you know, for example, I would say that the No Borders movement that I'm a part of, right, arguing for the abolition of border controls, absolutely has to call for the abolition of caste, right? Absolutely has to argue for, you know, it's not that we want to live in a world where everyone's moving because they're forced to, right? The No Borders movement also demands that people have a right to stay, right? That people shouldn't be forcibly moved. They shouldn't be dispossessed and displaced, right? They shouldn't feel the absolute urgency to have to move that so many people feel today, right? So I think, I don't know, if we can kind of hold all of that together, I think we can really talk about decolonizing migration.
Thank you so much. You absolutely provided light on the capital imperatives of migration, which I see as a much needed intervention. As we are moving towards the closing of our discussion, I would also like to take a minute to invite Professor Khadia and to share his perspectives on the discussion so far. Professor Khadia, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Manjima. I was actually hoping that our participants would raise many more questions because it was fascinating to listen to Professor Sharma, and of course the interaction that we had with a couple of participants. I'm sure there are going to be many more questions than answers. What I find fascinating about the title is the subtitle, The Trap. You know, we used to talk about in economics. You know, I'm a student of economics. Of course, I have become much more multidisciplinary. The field itself, migration, diaspora, and mobility, is a multidisciplinary field. But low-level equilibrium trap. You know, so I was just trying to think whether the post-colonial trap is something which should just pull us down to a level of equilibrium, which may not be may not be beneficial to any of the stakeholders. So we are all going to be losers at the same time. That's the question that comes to my mind. But you have touched upon a range of issues which make us think deep into. I was giving a keynote address at Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and it just became coincidence that I had decided on the topic a couple of months ago, and I called it open borders and closed doors. You know, so it became an irony that where there are open borders, the inside doors are closed or closing. like you have given so many examples of discrimination. You give the visa, but you don't give the work permit. That's what you had mentioned. And then there are layers and layers of discrimination that we come across. If we look at the Indian philosophy, because your presentation, your lecture, your talk, I would say, is actually, a lot of it is philosophy, which is the basis of all subjects. I think like that. And this is where we have this philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and we keep referring to that. It's also written on the Parliament House in India. But how many practice? I mean, has it become just a cliche, or is it something to be followed and practiced? And that's where I think, conflict of interest comes into play. And this conflict of interest that you started with colonialism, the foreigners and the citizens, Now, whether it is foreigners versus the citizens or citizens versus citizens, that is the second-class citizens or third-class citizens. That, I think, is the core which needs to be given a thought in terms of your disposition. I'm also, made to think about global commons on the other extreme. We think of the 5 global commons that are the high oceans and the atmosphere and the Antarctica. And now we also have what is called the internet is also called part of this. And I think the ownership rights is actually running contrary to global commons, the concept of global commons. So that is where I think the contradiction lies, that without ownership, you cannot give the privileges. You cannot distribute the limited resources that we have among the larger number of beneficiaries. But at the same time, you have this, kind of a kind of conflict between different classes, different castes, and so on that you have mentioned. So I tend to think that perhaps we need to have more debates on this issue, and we would like to, like you to come back after some time, perhaps, to continue this dialogue, where we can make it more participatory. And you perhaps can share with us a number of issues and questions in advance, and then we what do you think, Manjima, about that? And Paddy, what do you think of that kind of a second part of the debate? Like we have listened to Professor Sharma a great deal today, but let us have a debate on them. That perhaps would be the reward that we will get from this series of lectures. So I would like to not monopolize the time, because time has already run out, but I would request you to extend maybe by 5 or 10 minutes and give the opportunity to our audience to raise more questions, not in the chat, but by voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Galia. I would very much like the audience to ask more questions as well, but it's quite late in India, and that perhaps could be a reason why we do not see much speakers here, at least in terms of questions.
You are right. Actually, I am sitting in Washington, D.C., so it's midday here, like Professor
It's
Sharma.
midnight here, so it's
Oh,
12.
wow. Okay. Oh, my goodness. Oh, no. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So
I
maybe
think
back
you
to
should be
Paddy then.
glad that
Paddy?
even though it's midnight, we are sticking to it, and
Yes,
because the talk was really, really,
Exactly.
really
that's the
intriguing.
hallmark.
And
That's the hallmark. Yes, it's
Manjima, there are
fascinating. But
questions.
I would request Manjima and Paddy to have the last word, please. And maybe Paddy, your reflections.
Yes, I would like to call on Ms. Paddy as well to share her reflections and to conclude and close the discussion. I have
Thank you.
more or less addressed all the questions in the chat box as well. So yes, Ms. Paddy.
Manjima and Professor Nandita, I think just to thank you both for a very engaging discussion. And I think the insights that you also brought out, Professor Nandita, for us were very interesting. And I would agree with Professor Binod's suggestion for us to open up this debate, perhaps at a time that is also suitable in a time zone for India. I don't know how we make that work, but I'm sure we can find an opportunity one day where the time zones work. The idea really with the Expert Dialogue series is indeed that kind of engagement, that kind of debate, because we also think that debate extends our knowledge, but also debate helps us to break down a lot of these conceptual notions that we sort of see. I think when you broke down, for instance, talking about decolonization and what it has meant, an interesting reflection into even the British society feeling that part of they themselves wanting to decolonize, you know. And I was thinking about how decolonization as a concept or sort of more visibly, I think we also saw it a couple of years ago when we saw statues going down, right? And we thought this was a demonstration that things were really going to change. And yet I think today what you've talked to us is also sort of what is sitting in the system, what's embedded behind the policy, what's embedded behind public policy, and how do we really decolonize from a place where sometimes it's very difficult to see what are the origins, what are the natives, but also breaking down also some of these concepts where I think within this space of development and migration governance, sometimes we're picking on words and we're picking on concepts without having the opportunity to really have some divergent views. So we thank you for the time that you've taken today. We thank the participants that have also been debating in the chat. Thank you so much for these perspectives. For us, it's always very interesting and to see these views, but also questions that are raised to our experts. And we look forward to an opportunity to engage with you. We will continue on the topic of decolonization, also again in these coming months. And again, we will have an opportunity where we bring back Professor Nandita when the time works for her as well, and also in seeing how do we expand the debate indeed, and how do we look into the different notions as we really try to seek alternatives to how our worlds will develop and how our people will be provided for, because essentially that's where we're going to. I thought that was a really interesting discussion, and wanted to just thank everyone, to say good night to those who are in India, a good afternoon to those who are starting their afternoon, and indeed I think it's still good morning for Professor Binod and Professor Nandita. So do enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much. The recording is going to be available on YouTube, so you can feel free to share. And if you're not following JRFDT, we ask that you follow us on YouTube and all the social media. You'll be able to see upcoming sessions where we try to break down a lot of these concepts. Thank you so much for your time, and see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.